Hello and welcome to another episode of From the Beginning here on Heavenward Thinking. Today we begin the story of Joseph. We reached Genesis chapter 37. I'm going to read the first part of it and we'll get right into today's topic. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob's family line. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah, and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives, and he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he made an ornate robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him, and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of this dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So, once again, we see that there are some patterns in this family. We've gone through and we've seen the difficult struggles that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Esau had. We saw what favoritism looks like when you have one brother pitted against another, and we've seen all these things, the deception, the lies, the jealousy, all these things that have gone on in this family, and here we see that a lot of it is going to be repeated in this story. So we start off with Jacob. He's living in the land where his father had been. He's living in Canaan. And then we get right after that to our hero of the story, or the main person that we focus on in this story, Joseph. He was a man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers. And we see that he brought back a bad report to his father about his brothers. Whether he did this in a good intention sort of way, or whether he was doing this out of pride or trying to get his brothers in trouble, we don't know based on the context in here. But whatever the case, he seems to have had something against his brothers, or his brothers had something against him, and we see that right in the next couple verses, because not only do we have this bad report that's going to start to have some division in the family that we've already seen lots of problems with before, we're seeing that division starting now with Jacob's sons. And we have now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age, and he had made an ornate robe for him. This would have been an awesome gift to set apart, to symbolize that Joseph was loved more than his other brothers. Joseph had a special significance to his father, Jacob, also known as Israel here. And we see that there is something special about him already in this story. If we've read this story before, we know what God's going to do in the end. We know that Joseph is going to be a huge part of saving many lives, and that God's going to do amazing things in him. But even here at the beginning, we already see he is different. He's unique. He is here being showed favoritism by his father, a priority over his brothers, even though he was not the oldest brother, which would be very unique in this culture at this time, that he would have been given this amazing gift, even though he was not the youngest, or the oldest. And so we already see that there's some unique things going on in this story. But, unfortunately, we see that his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, and they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, this seems very extreme, that they hated him so much they couldn't even speak one kind word to him, but we see the same thing in our own lives. I would imagine that each one of us have had someone in our life that we hate so much, or that we don't like. Maybe we won't even admit that it's hate. We don't like so much that we can't even say one nice thing about that person. And so we can find ourselves, even in this part of the story, we can identify with his brothers. Each of us could give an account of how someone has been shown favor, maybe at a workplace, maybe one of our relatives, whatever it may be. Someone has been shown favor that we don't think they deserve and that we think we deserve. And then we get jealous of that favor. And then we have not just jealousy, but hatred, anger, and then it festers to the point of mistreating people and never being able to be around that person without thinking bad thoughts, saying bad things, never being able to say anything good about them. And that leads to division, and it leads to all sorts of problems, as we're going to see demonstrated very powerfully in this family. To make matters worse, Joseph has a dream, and in the dream, he says, "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." Now, this is not a genius move on Joseph's part. If you knew that your brothers, you had already gotten them in trouble, you brought back a bad report, and you knew your brothers couldn't even speak a kind word to you because they were jealous of you, it probably would not go well if you told them that they were going to eventually bow down before you and that you were going to be some kind of ruler or some kind of authority over them, or be in a place of honor where they would not be, and they would think that they should be. So this is not a good example of how we should talk to people. If God gives us a dream, even if we know this is a dream from God, as Joseph clearly thought this was a dream from God, if we are given that, we probably should not go around broadcasting that to people before God tells us to do so, before God tells us to speak to people. If he has not told us to go announce it, it's probably not a good idea to go shouting it from the rooftops and telling people that they're going to bow down before you and you're going to be this big shot. Not a great idea. Humility is what Joseph seems to be lacking in the early part of the story. And now, most of the time when we look at the story of Joseph, we take the angle of he was this great righteous man who was very humble, who was willing to go through all these great trials and tribulations, and that he had perseverance, and then the Lord used him in a mighty way. And that's all true, but we often skip over this first section and the first parts where we get to see, just as we've seen with Abraham, with Isaac, with Jacob, we get to see the progression of his faith journey and how he matures in his spirituality and in his faith, how the Lord is going to transform him through the trials and tribulations. So while he is certainly the man that we are trying to live our lives as an example after throughout most of the story, this is a part that we can look and we can learn something, not by what he's doing right, but what he's doing wrong, and we should try to avoid those same traps. So humility is something that we all need to look at because it's something that we all struggle with. It's the number one problem of where sin comes in. Sin comes when pride comes in. It's how we fell, as we saw in the Garden of Eden, when we tried to be God. We tried to become God. And in our pride, we sinned and we rebelled against God. And so every sin is filled with pride, and it is rooted in pride. And so we see that here in this chapter, and we see that pride can lead to not only problems for ourselves, but for those around us, and it can just lead to a lot of problems, as we see here. So he does this, he tells them, and they respond with more hatred. They hated him all the more, it says, because of the dream and what he had said in verse 8. And in verse 9, to make matters even worse, he says, then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers, "Listen, I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." So to go even further, he's saying not only are his brothers going to bow down before him, but this is implying that his mother and father are going to be bowing down before him. This is really setting himself up to be somebody important, to be someone big, because we already know that Jacob right now is really important because he is carrying on that Abrahamic covenant. So Jacob, in this dream, is going to be bowing down before Joseph. That would be a huge deal because Jacob's supposed to be this important guy, this man of high position because of what God's calling him to. So it's really showing that Joseph somehow, at 17 years old, was filled with the same kind of thoughts that most 17-year-olds are today in our modern world, where they know everything, they think they know everything, and they think that they're going to be so great. And all of us, whether or not we're 17 or much older or much younger, we all have those same thoughts where we think we're going to be something great because God shows us a little glimpse of our future. God shows us a little glimpse of what could be. He gives us an ambition. He gives us a dream of some sort or an idea, and we just run with it, and we want it to happen right away. And then we get into some serious problems because we don't take time, reflect on what God's calling us to, seek his guidance and his timing, which is so key. And that leads us to some serious problems, as we see here with Joseph. So even his parents did not appreciate this. Not only were his brothers angry, but his mother and father were not super thrilled about this. Yet, it says in verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Clearly, we are continuing to see that Jacob has learned from what God has done in the past. He knows that God can speak through visions. He knows that God can speak in unique ways, and that he has very unique plans. So he's thinking this over, much like in the New Testament, where we have people like Mary who ponder things. They may not always understand what's happening, but they ponder things. And that's the same kind of thing that we see here with Jacob, also called Israel in this chapter. So we see a lot of different characters and a lot of different feelings and a lot of different problems, certainly, in this first section. But there's a lot that is laying the foundation, the groundwork, if you will, for what's going to come in the next several chapters, as we're going to see jealousy become division, become outright thinking of murder and betrayal and all kinds of different problems that are going to come from it. But we're going to see how God's hand still is involved in this story in every way, and we're going to see how God uses the bad to make good, how he challenges the characters in this story and changes them and brings about something incredible, just as he does in each and every one of our lives. So I'd encourage you to read ahead in Genesis chapter 37, read the story of Joseph throughout the rest of the book of Genesis. We're going to really be concentrating on Joseph here and how his brothers interact with him and all the different characters in the story. Read ahead and be ready as we continue from the beginning here on Heaven Writ Thinking.